we being watched by aliens from outer space? Are these the craft they're using to visit us? Did this Scottish forester really have a close encounter in this lonely glade? And what does this classic UFO film show? A flying saucer or something more down to earth? Mysteries from the files of Arthur C. Clarke, author of 2001 and inventor of the communications satellite. Now in retreat in Sri Lanka after a lifetime of science, space and writing, he ponders the riddles of this and other worlds.
I think I can claim to be a reluctant expert on UFOs. I've been interested in them for almost 50 years, long before the phrase flying saucers was invented. UFOs are very common. If you've never seen one, you're either unobservant or you live in a cloudy area. I've seen half a dozen good ones, and now I have some very definite opinions on the subject.
It was just before midnight on December the 30th, 1978, that this Argosy aircraft took off in New Zealand on a newspaper delivery run. It followed the route taken 10 days earlier by a plane which had reported weird flying objects off the Kaikoura coast, objects confirmed by radar controllers in Wellington. Now a TV crew was on board with Australian reporter Quentin Fogarty.
We're now approaching the Clarence River, where the highest concentration of UFOs was sighted on the morning of December the 21st. We're at an altitude of 14,000 feet, and we're on exactly the same route taken by Captain Powell when he encountered those mysterious objects. It's a beautiful, clear night outside, and naturally, we'll be looking out for anything unusual.
Hardly had Fogarty spoken when things began to happen.
We've just heard from Wellington radar that we've got an object about a mile behind us and it's following us. Let's hope they're friendly. It's really getting a bit frightening up here. There's a whole formation of unidentified flying objects behind us.
But there were closer encounters to come. On the return journey from Christchurch, Fogarty spotted another object.
It was extremely bright, much brighter than any of the other stars in the sky. Now it's just dimmed, it's gone. It's back again. It appears to be going behind cloud. I can't quite make out whether it in fact is going behind cloud or whether in fact the light is just dimming. No, it's such a bright light, it's lighting up the clouds around it. This is by far the best of the unidentified flying objects we've seen so far. According to our cameraman, David Crockett, who's been filming it for the past few moments, it appears to have a brightly lit bottom and a transparent sort of sphere on top, so it appears to be, well, like a flying saucer. Got another one right in front of us, very bright, giving off an orange flashing light. It looks like an aircraft beacon. Seems to be rolling and turning. Oh, I don't know. I really don't know what's going on.
After the plane landed at Blenheim, the investigation began. Skeptics suggested they'd seen the planet Venus, but most of the film was taken more than half an hour before Venus could have been visible. An American Navy physicist, Dr. Bruce Maccabee, analyzed the film and rejected theories that it showed meteors or ships or birds. Several of the objects had shown up on radar screens. One of them had left this extraordinary trail on a single frame of film. And although the start of this sequence is out of focus, some frames seem to show what the TV crew and pilots said they'd seen. a luminous base with a transparent top. Dr. Maccabee's conclusion: no known explanation could account for all the facts. Trying to trap a UFO is now big business. In the scrubland of Texas, Ray Stanford heads Project Starlight International with $1 million worth of equipment. The laser is to signal to spaceships his goggles in case they answer back. The aim is to use the highest technology to establish beyond doubt that craft from other times or worlds are visiting the Earth. Centerpiece of Project Starlight's armory is a computer to monitor UFO activities in the area.
When if this line doesn't begin to show up, I'll turn it to...
This is an Operation Argus alert. Please proceed as you have been instructed.
The computer automatically calls up spotters to scan the skies. And it really hits the panic button if a landing is indicated. With techniques like these, Stanford hopes to add to the evidence he's already amassed. Like this film he shot at Corpus Christi in Texas in 1959.
After extensive endeavor to explain it, neither the Air Force nor the National Investigation Committee on Aerial Phenomena could come up with any ordinary explanation. I don't know what it was, but it was tubular and bright, and small objects came and departed at high speed. We have motion picture films, magnetometer recordings, sound recordings, and a whole variety of data that begin to make us think that UFOs are technological, that they're really not something natural after all, but something not only technological, but highly sophisticated and capable of speeds and accelerations far beyond anything that we've ever dreamed of. In fact, we've really been surprised at how fast these things can move that we've tracked. And frankly, I would say that they simply don't originate on the Earth, at least any place on the Earth that I know of. If the Soviet Union has that kind of technology, God help the free world. And if the free world has it, God help the Soviets.
It was this man, Kenneth Arnold, from Boise in Idaho, who ushered in the era of the flying saucer. On June the 24th, 1947, he took off from this airfield at Chehalis in Washington State and headed for the high Cascade Mountains. A member of the Idaho Search and Rescue Organization, his intention was to look for a crashed military aircraft. But as he scoured the slopes of Mount Rainier, something happened to change his life and trigger off a worldwide obsession that endures to this day.
At this point is when I would say approximately is where I had this terrific flash hit the air. My aircraft lit up the inside of my aircraft, and I assumed, of course, at the time in a split second that it was probably a P-51 fighter that had dove over my nose, and that it was the sun's reflecting upon his bright wing surfaces that caused it. However, before I gathered my wits together, I looked way off here to the north, and then when I saw where the flash came from, it was an echelon formation of very peculiar-looking aircraft, and they were rapidly approaching Mount Rainier. And it was at about this point when I got here, I could see their tail surfaces, or the rear end of them, and the second craft from the rear had a more or less crescent-shaped look, and it had a hole in the center of it. And of course, I kept mulling in my mind, that's the damnedest looking airplane I ever saw.
Arnold timed the craft as they sped between two mountain peaks almost 50 miles apart.
I looked at my sweep second hand on my 24-hour clock, and they had covered this distance of approximately 50 miles in 1 minute and 42 seconds. It was placing their speed at approximately 1,700 miles an hour, 1,781 it came out at that distance, which was, of course, unheard of in 1947.
He abandoned his search and landed. Later, he was besieged by reporters, and one of them asked him how the objects flew.
I says, well, I tell you, they flew like erratically like a saucer would if you skipped it across the water. And of course then all of a sudden the term flying disc and this type of thing, or crescent shaped or whatnot, was completely dropped, and everybody started seeing flying saucers. And they've been seeing them ever since.
And photographing them too. Anywhere from Australia, where a sheep farmer took this strange shot, to America and this 1950 classic from McMinnville in Oregon. Some pictures show such detail that skeptics simply scoff. Others are more enigmatic. This is from Madre de Dios in Peru. This was taken by teenager Stephen Pratt at Conisborough in Yorkshire. Pictures can be faked, and eyewitnesses can be mistaken. The object reported here to be bluish at first, then red and luminous, was almost certainly Venus. The witness, Jimmy Carter, later President of the United States. Sometimes hundreds of people can be fooled. Many thought this apparition over the Rocky Mountains was a spaceship. In fact, it was a large meteorite which grazed the Earth's atmosphere 40 miles up and then bounced off forever into space.
But don't laugh at these people. Anybody can be fooled by a thing like this. I've been myself. In fact, behind these doors is my own favorite personal UFO. Hemin. I was standing in the garden of my house late one afternoon. The sun was just above the horizon, and higher up in the sky, the planet Venus was shining like a brilliant star. It was such a beautiful sight that I called out one of my staff and said, "Look, Venus." And he looked up and said, "Oh yes, Venus." And I said, "No, Venus." He looked again, "Venus." I realized a few minutes later there were two stars shining brightly in the sky. The other object further to the north was just as bright as Venus and apparently motionless. It took me quite a while to find out what it was. It was the local weather balloon, and it was becalmed maybe 40,000 feet up. So it looked like a brilliant object, silvery object in the sky, a most convincing UFO.
Can mistaken identities also explain the handful of cine films which appear to show UFOs, like this one shot by surveyor Peter Day near Aylesbury in southern England? Or this hazy footage taken at a baseball stadium in Great Falls, Montana, which some think shows Air Force jets preparing to land. Or this, filmed by a British television crew in Oxfordshire. Could it be, as some suggest, simply an American Air Force plane jettisoning fuel high above the Earth? One of the most celebrated of all UFO films is this, shot at Catalina Island in California by professional cameraman Lee Hansen.
It was one of these clear days, and that's why I was up, because you could see to infinity, and it was an ideal day for aerial photography. And it appeared silver with a shadow underneath, as though it was metallic, and it was moving at a rate of speed, I would say 150 miles an hour plus or minus, and appeared to be maybe 20 meters across.
We decided to analyze the Catalina film. At the Jet Propulsion Laboratories in Pasadena, California, every frame is scanned and turned into numbers by Dr. Robert Nathan, top expert in the computer enhancement of photographs. His object is to get the clearest possible picture by averaging the best frames of the film. The first frame is called in from the magnetic tape and repeated on the right-hand side of the screen.
Now there's going to be a series of operations where I'm going to take the picture and start editing it to the next picture. The second photograph is being brought in. Its contrast is stretched. And now it is being added to the first photograph. This picture now represents the average of the two photographs. And we're beginning to see a smoothing out of the background sky and an emergence of various shapes in the object. The third photograph has been brought in. This picture shows the average of all of these three. And now you begin to see an appearance of a strong white image on the top. And there seems to be some holes or some kind of transparency underneath here. One takes a good look at this, and considering that the speed of the object, as reported by Lee Hansen, the photographer, is that this is moving at about 120 miles an hour, this begins to look like a small commercial airplane. And one can draw the comparison that you have the bright wing on the top, the windows, and the stabilizer, the rudder structure, and that's it. The Catalina film, I'm afraid, falls into the category of an identified flying airplane.
Well, I've looked at this film quite a few times, and I'm convinced that it was a small private plane. There's no need to look any further for an explanation. And that, of course, is the trouble with long-range sightings. We can never be absolutely sure what they were. But even if it was a visitor from outer space, we couldn't prove it. For this reason, I'm no longer interested in UFO sightings. But what does intrigue me, what is very mysterious, are the so-called close encounters.
One such encounter happened to Mrs. Jessie Rustenberg, then living in this Staffordshire farmhouse.
It was on an October day, the 21st of October in 1954. I was in the back kitchen of the house preparing myself, just having washed, and I heard this noise. Now, it was just like a giant cauldron of water being poured onto a red-hot fire, but if you can imagine, 1,000 times louder. And my first reaction was the children. I must get out, there's a plane crashing. So I slipped on my jumper, I ran out through the side entrance of the house towards the front garden to look for them coming across the fields. And to my amazement, there, suspended on the top of the roof of this old farm, was this object that I can only describe as a huge Mexican hat. It was that shape without the bubbles. It must have been 15 to 20 yards from where I stood. It covered the roof, so in circumference it must have been about 60 feet. It was enormous. The people in the spacecraft were just looking out. I could see them from the waist to the top of their heads. They were very beautiful people. They had long golden hair, like the old kings used to wear, turned under. They had a very vivid blue, like ski top affair on. And they just looked at us. Their eyes, the expression in their eyes were full of compassion. And then, all of a sudden, I felt the tension leaving me, and I felt movement, and I turned round to touch my children, and when I looked again, it was gone. Now, we stood there, and I said to the boys, "Did you see what I seen?" "Yes, Mummy, yes." I said, "Well, where is it? It's gone." And we looked, and my second son said, "There it is, Mum." And we watched it in the sky, just like a cotton reel, circle round the farm 3 times, and then it just shot straight up and away.
But just occasionally, there is physical evidence to back up reports of close encounters. On the morning of November the 9th, 1979, forestry worker Bob Taylor walked down this woodland track outside Livingston New Town near Edinburgh. He rounded a corner and was astonished to be confronted by an unearthly object.
It was a huge thing with a big round dome, a very dark grey colour, and it had a big flange going all the way around. I could see arms sticking out of this flange with what I took to be blades on the top.
Later, he described what he'd seen to a local newspaper artist who drew this sketch.
As I stood here, there was two balls came out, two balls. I'd think they'd be about 3 feet in diameter with about 6 spikes. And they were rolling on these spikes. And they came right up beside me. And I remember feeling a tug at that time. I had a very powerful smell, a choking sort of smell. And that was it.
He crawled up this path and staggered home, to be met on the doorstep by his bewildered wife.
It looked terrible when he came in the door, and he just stood at the door, and I said, "Have you had an accident with your lorry?" And he said, "No, I've been attacked." And I said, "What with?" And he said, "A spaceship." And I said, "Oh, goodness me, there's no such a thing as a spaceship. I'm going to phone the doctor. You must have fell and hurt your head." He looked quite shocked, and he was drained. He was right white, and his face was dirty, and he had a red scar here. And his clothes were all dirty, and his trousers. And then he told me his trousers had been torn.
Police station, Bathgate.
The police were called, and they discovered inexplicable track marks at the scene of the incident.
On examining the area, I found 2 track marks in approximately 40 holes in the ground. And these are the track marks here, and these are the 40 holes. Since then, I've photographed the holes. This is a photograph of the hole here. This is the holes that measured approximately 3.5 inches. And this other photograph here, you can actually see the tread marks which correspond to the marks here. These markings and tracks were actually inside this area here that's fenced off. And there was definitely no other tracks leading to or from this area.
These are the trousers worn by Mr. Taylor. As you can see, they're of fairly heavy material. We have a tear on the left, just below the pocket, and one on the right trouser leg, again just below the pocket. These marks are consistent with the material having been pulled up while the trousers were being worn.
Well, I'm pretty certain that day that I saw a spaceship sitting here.
We must accept the story of Mr. Taylor. He is a very highly respected member of the community, a man of high integrity, and not one likely to invent such a story.
Personally, I'm convinced that there must be many, many higher civilizations in this enormous and incredibly ancient universe of ours. And since we are preparing to go out into space ourselves, other older races may have been doing this for millions of years. So it's quite reasonable to think that they may have come here in the remote past, perhaps many times, as indeed suggested in 2001. So we should look for evidence of such visits, physical evidence in the form, for example, of fossilized transistor radios or their equivalent. But the question is, are they still coming now? Well, at this moment, we have radar networks, American, Russian, and doubtless others, plotting, tracking everything in space. Anything as big as a pencil in orbit around the Earth can be tracked by these radars. Is it conceivable that we've been having visitors over the last decades trying to sneak up on us, landing in obscure places, being seen by a few people, and not by these enormous tracking networks? I feel that when there really is a visitation from space, it'll be something spectacular, rather like the climax of the movie, Close Encounters of the Third Kind. We'll be certain of it within about 5 minutes. You may wonder, what should you do if you do meet a visitor from space? Well, be very polite and be prepared for a long journey.
Next week, dragons, dinosaurs, and giant snakes.